If you've ever tried to explain this feeling, you probably reached for the wrong words. You said empty. You said nothing. You said, I just don't feel anymore. But that language never quite fit, did it? Because what you're living with doesn't feel like a void. It feels more like standing at the edge of something sealed off, a quiet line you're not meant to cross. Emotional numbness is often misunderstood as absence, as if something vital disappeared. But in lived experience, it's closer to a frozen frontier, a guarded border. What looks like nothing from the outside is, on the inside, a territory under heavy watch. Nothing moves there, not because there is nothing to feel, but because something once hurt enough that movement became dangerous. For many men, this border didn't appear overnight. It formed slowly, through adaptation, through learning what was rewarded and what was punished, through discovering, again and again, that being functional mattered more than being present, that being useful mattered more than being honest, that showing up meant producing results, not revealing inner weather. Modern culture quietly trains men this way. Be efficient, be composed, be reliable. Don't burden the room with uncertainty. Don't leak emotion into systems that reward output. Over time, feeling becomes inefficient. Presence becomes risky, so the system adapts, not consciously. Biologically, emotion is not eliminated, it's contained. A more accurate image is not a blank space, but a castle gate lowered after betrayal. The guard didn't fall asleep. He was posted there for a reason. Something crossed the line once. Rejection, humiliation, chaos, loss, and the cost was too high. So the order was given: hold the line, close the gate, keep the interior safe, even if it means living with silence. This is important to say clearly. Numbness is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is not a lack of depth or sensitivity. It is a protective intelligence that learned at some point that openness came with danger, and it did exactly what it was designed to do. The cost, though, is quiet and cumulative. Relationships begin to flatten. Conversations stay polite, but never land. Desire loses its direction, not because you don't want, but because wanting without feeling makes no sense. Purpose blurs. You keep moving, but the movement feels hollow, like walking without friction. And because the pain is muted, it's hard to point to what's wrong. Nothing is obviously broken. You're functioning. You're surviving. From the outside, things may even look stable, but inside, there's a persistent sense that something essential is behind glass. Visible, untouchable. Many men interpret this as a personal flaw, as if others were born with a capacity they somehow missed, as if numbness were a personality trait rather than a pattern. But beneath this experience lies structure. Not identity, not destiny. A pattern that formed for reasons that once made sense. In psychological language, this is not the absence of emotion. It's emotion under lock and key. In symbolic terms, the feeling world went underground, not because it disappeared, but because the surface became unsafe, and the part of you that guards that border has been standing watch for a very long time. What matters here is not forcing the gate open, not demanding feeling on command, not shaming the guard for doing his job too well. What matters first is seeing the border for what it is. A line drawn in response to real experience. A solution that outlived the situation it was built for. If any of this resonates, let it land without analysis. Notice what your body does as you hear it. The breath, the jaw, the chest. Numbness often reveals itself not through emotion, but through sensation, or the lack of it. This series is not about diagnosing you or fixing you. It's about mapping what's actually happening beneath the surface, with enough clarity that shame can loosen its grip. Because beneath numbness lies a pattern, not a defect. A history, not a verdict. Stay with this. At the midpoint, we'll expose the specific pattern men consistently miss that keeps numbness locked in place. For many men, numbness doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like calm, like composure, like finally having things under control. There's no chaos spilling out, no tears interrupting the day, no emotional volatility pulling focus away from work or responsibility. On the surface, it can look like maturity, but when you stay with it long enough, a different texture emerges. This calm is tight. It's vigilant. It requires constant management. It's not the ease of safety, it's the stillness of restraint. Often, Beneath this state lives a simple fear that never fully got named, the fear of being overwhelmed again. Not hypothetically, but specifically. Overwhelmed by emotion that once came too fast, too strong, or without support. Overwhelmed by grief that had nowhere to land. By anger that would have cost belonging. By longing that was never met. The system learned something very precise. Feeling equals flood, and flood equals danger. So control stepped in. This is where numbness quietly masquerades as regulation. The body appears steady, but it's steady in the way a clenched fist is steady. Muscles held, breath shallow, attention narrowed. Nothing spills, because nothing is allowed to move. From the perspective of the nervous system, this makes sense. When stress becomes chronic, regulation shifts away from integration and toward survival. Energy is routed into loops that maintain function, predictability, and vigilance. Less toward reflection, less toward emotional nuance, less toward states that require safety to unfold. In this state, emotion isn't absent, it's suspended. A common misunderstanding is that numbness means low emotion. In reality, it often means the opposite. Too much emotion, stored without a safe channel. Imagine water behind a dam that was never designed to hold that volume. The solution wasn't to drain it. It was to stop looking at it, to redirect attention elsewhere, to keep the gates sealed and call the stillness peace. This is why many men struggle to name what they're feeling, even when something is clearly off. Subtle emotions blur together. Sadness doesn't arrive as sadness, it shows up as irritation. Grief disguises itself as fatigue. Longing turns into restlessness. Instead of tears, there's scrolling. Instead of reflection, stimulation. Instead of contact, distraction. The system isn't broken, it's efficient. It found ways to discharge energy without touching the original source. Compulsive habits often enter here, not as moral failures but as pressure valves. Small hits of intensity that momentarily cut through the flatness. Not because they bring peace, but because they bring sensation. Something, anything, to remind the system that it's still alive. What's often missed is that control itself becomes the surface defense. Keeping everything contained, managed, and predictable feels like safety. But control is not the original wound. It's the adaptation layered on top of it. If you listen carefully, this controlled calm has a quality of effort. A subtle vigilance. A sense that if you let go even a little, something might spill out that you don't know how to hold. That fear doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from memory, stored not as a story, but as a bodily expectation. This is where attachment history quietly enters the picture. Long before there were words for emotion, there were experiences of what happened when feelings emerged. Were they met, dismissed, mocked, ignored? Did they overwhelm the adults in the room? Did expressing need lead to closeness or to distance? Over time, the body answers these questions for you. And if the answer was consistently unsafe, control becomes the language of survival. Numbness, then, is not a failure to feel. It's a decision made without words. Feeling is too costly. Control is cheaper. But beneath that control, something remains unfinished. Something held in suspension. And if control is the visible strategy, the real wound lies deeper, in attachment memory, where the nervous system learned what was allowed to move and what had to be contained. Don't skip ahead. 2 topics from now, we test this understanding against a real survivor story that quietly overturns the shame many men carry about numbness. To understand how numbness becomes so stable, it helps to widen the lens beyond individual history. Not to escape responsibility, but to place it where it belongs. Much of what men carry did not begin with them. It was inherited, not as genetics alone, but as instruction, as atmosphere, as unspoken agreements about what earns belonging. For generations, many boys learned a quiet rule early on. Approval was conditional. It arrived when composure replaced vulnerability, when strength meant not needing, when expression was trimmed down to what wouldn't disrupt the emotional economy of the family. Love was present, but it had terms. Often this was transmitted through the father line, not always through cruelty, but through absence or restraint. Affection offered for achievement, attention earned through performance, silence rewarded with respect. The lesson wasn't spoken aloud, but it was felt clearly enough. Emotions complicate things. Suppression keeps the peace. Over time, this becomes an internal bargain, belonging in exchange for silence. From a Jungian perspective, this is where the persona begins to harden. The persona is the face turned toward the world, shaped to meet expectations. In healthy form, it's flexible. It allows participation without self-erasure. But when belonging depends on suppression, the persona stiffens. It becomes armor. What doesn't fit behind that armor doesn't disappear. It moves elsewhere. Jung used the word shadow to describe what gets pushed out of awareness, not because it's bad, but because it's inconvenient or unsafe. In men shaped by this ancestral deal, the shadow often carries grief that was never welcomed, longing that felt childish, fear that threatened status, and tenderness that had no mirror. The more consistently these parts were exiled, the more weight they accumulated. And because they were never integrated, they began to feel dangerous. Not morally dangerous, but destabilizing. If let out, they might cost approval, control, worth. This pattern didn't only live inside families. Cultures once provided rites of passage that allowed boys to meet emotion within structure. Fear, pain, grief, and awe had places to move, witnesses to hold them, symbols to translate them. As those rites faded, initiation didn't disappear. It went underground. Modern men often self-initiate through numbing instead of integrating, through silence instead of guidance, through endurance rather than meaning. The body still seeks transition, but without communal containment, the safest path becomes reduction. Less feeling, less risk, less exposure. Inside this context, a belief loop quietly forms. It rarely sounds dramatic. It sounds reasonable. If I feel, I lose control. If I lose control, I lose worth. And if I lose worth, I lose belonging. This belief doesn't announce itself as belief. It shows up as habit, as restraint, as an automatic tightening when emotion approaches the surface, as a reflexive return to function. Over time, numbness becomes more than protection. It becomes identity adjacent, not consciously chosen, but relied upon. A strategy that worked well enough to keep life moving, to stay included, to avoid rejection, ridicule, or chaos. But strategies built for belonging often get reenacted in intimacy. The same silence that once preserved connection now limits it. Relationships begin to mirror the original contract. Depth is desired, but only up to the point where it threatens stability. Emotional distance feels familiar, predictable, safer than presence. This is how numbness turns into a relational strategy. Not because men don't want closeness, but because closeness was once paired with risk, and the nervous system, faithful to its training, chooses what it knows how to survive. Seen this way, numbness is not a personal failure. It's a legacy pattern. An old agreement still being honored long after the conditions that required it have passed. And that inheritance sets the stage for what comes next. Because when numbness becomes a way of staying safe, the body can form bonds not just with people, but with the state of shutdown itself. At this point, many explanations about numbness begin to collapse under their own weight. They assume something is missing. That emotion shut down because it was weak, insufficient, or undeveloped. But there is another pattern that only becomes visible when you stop asking what's absent and start asking what the body has learned to trust. Sometimes, numbness isn't distance from danger. It's attachment to safety. Not safety as comfort or warmth, but safety as predictability, as neutrality, as the absence of sudden emotional shifts. When someone lives through relational chaos, hot and cold dynamics, volatility, inconsistency, the nervous system adapts in a very specific way. It stops reaching for connection and starts anchoring to what feels least threatening. Often, that state is emotional shutdown. In trauma psychology, the body doesn't choose what feels good. It chooses what feels survivable. Intermittent threat, periods of closeness followed by withdrawal, affection followed by punishment, calm followed by explosion, conditions the nervous system to distrust emotional intensity. Even positive feelings begin to feel unsafe, because they've historically preceded loss or harm. Over time, neutrality becomes preferable to hope. This is how a trauma bond can form without a person attached to it. The bond isn't to an individual, but to a state, a bodily memory that says, when I feel less, nothing bad happens. When I stay flat, I stay safe. Many men encounter this most clearly after leaving a volatile relationship. On the outside, the danger has ended. There's no more conflict, no more emotional whiplash, no more walking on eggshells. Friends expect relief, closure, a return to peace. But instead, what arrives feels like emptiness. One survivor described it quietly, without drama. After months of chaos, the silence felt wrong. There was no pain, but there was no pleasure either. Mornings were calm, but hollow. Even relief felt muted, as if the system didn't know how to register safety without intensity. This often becomes a source of shame. The mind says, something must be wrong. I escaped. Why don't I feel free? But the body is answering a different question. It's saying, the danger stopped, but the pattern hasn't been updated yet. For a long time, safety meant shutting down, and the nervous system doesn't immediately relinquish what kept it alive. This is the reversal many men miss. Numbness can appear after danger ends, not during it. It can show up precisely when life becomes quieter. When there's no longer an external threat to focus on, the internal adaptation remains in place. Seen through this lens, numbness stops looking like damage and starts looking like loyalty. Loyalty to a strategy that once worked. Loyalty to a form of safety that required vigilance, containment, and emotional reduction. The critical shift happens when the question changes. Not what's wrong with me, but what am I protecting? Not why can't I feel, but what does my body believe will happen if I do? This reframing doesn't rush the answer. It creates space for curiosity without blame. It acknowledges that numbness may not be an enemy to defeat, but a memory to understand. At the midpoint of this conversation, that understanding matters, because when numbness hardens into identity, something else quietly drains away alongside it. Not emotion alone, but meaning. And when meaning erodes, the psyche responds in its own way, by turning the volume down even further. Hold that question. Next, we examine why purpose often collapses when numbness becomes more than a state and starts to feel like who you are. There is a moment many men recognize, even if they've never put words to it. Life continues. Responsibilities remain. The calendar fills, but something essential has thinned out. Actions still happen, yet they no longer carry inner weight. You get through the day, but the day doesn't quite get through to you. This is not depression in the dramatic sense. There may be no despair, no collapse, no overt sadness. Instead, there is a quieter erosion, a sense that effort no longer points anywhere, that movement lacks direction, that the why behind action has gone faint. In psychological terms, this is often a loss of telos. Telos simply means inner direction, not goals on a checklist, but the felt sense that life is moving towards something meaningful. When telos fades, the psyche adapts, not by protesting loudly, but by dimming sensation. Feeling is expensive. It requires engagement. It asks the body to care. And when caring no longer seems to matter, when effort doesn't connect to purpose, the system conserves energy by turning the volume down. Philosophically, this resembles what Nietzsche described as passive nihilism. Not rage against life, but quiet resignation. Life goes on, but without inner participation. The world isn't rejected, it's endured. Numbness, in this frame, is not despair. It's the absence of vitality that follows when meaning drains away. From a neuropsychological perspective, the same pattern appears through a different lens. The brain's reward systems are not designed to respond to action alone. They respond to action that aligns with personal significance. When behavior becomes disconnected from inner values, the circuitry responsible for motivation and pleasure gradually desensitizes. This doesn't mean you stop functioning. It means the internal signal weakens. The body no longer registers satisfaction, anticipation, or fulfillment with the same clarity. Over time, sensation flattens, not because the system is broken, but because it's responding accurately to a life that feels directionless. Perfectionism and procrastination often emerge here, not as opposites, but as companions. One demands flawless output to justify effort. The other delays action that feels pointless. Both protect against the deeper discomfort of acting without meaning. In this state, men often try to fix numbness by intensifying feeling. More stimulation, more urgency, more pressure to care. But this approach misunderstands the sequence. Meaning doesn't return because sensation is forced. Sensation returns when meaning quietly re-enters. This is why restoring feeling doesn't begin with emotional excavation. It begins with orientation, with the slow reappearance of direction, with small moments where action and value begin to realign, even faintly. When the psyche senses that effort might matter again, it gradually allows sensation back online. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to register texture, weight, presence. Without meaning, sensation fades. This is not a punishment. It's a conservation strategy. And understanding that prepares the ground for what comes next. Because when numbness has lasted a long time, the instinct is often to force feeling back into existence. And that instinct, however understandable, usually backfires. That is where the next movement of this conversation begins. When numbness has been present for a long time, it creates a particular kind of impatience. Not loud or dramatic, but subtle. A sense that something needs to break open. That feeling must be retrieved somehow, quickly, decisively, as if it were an object lost under rubble. Many men reach this point after months or years of emotional flatness. They begin to seek intensity, not always consciously but instinctively. Strong experiences, sharp conversations, extreme stimulation, anything that might pierce the surface and prove that feeling is still possible. The impulse makes sense. If numbness feels like absence, then intensity feels like the opposite. But this approach misunderstands how emotion actually returns. The nervous system does not reopen through force. It reopens through predictability, through signals that say the environment is stable enough for sensation to move again. Pressure, urgency, and self-demand tend to communicate the opposite message. They tell the system that something is still wrong, still unsafe, still requiring vigilance. This is why attempts to feel again often lead to frustration or exhaustion. There may be brief spikes, anger, desire, agitation, but they don't integrate. They pass through without landing. The system flares and then retreats, reinforcing the sense that something is blocked or broken. Emotion, in healthy form, emerges when the body senses continuity. Not excitement, but reliability. Not intensity, but rhythm. Feeling is not an event. It's a process that unfolds when there is enough safety for subtlety. Clinically, one of the earliest signs that shutdown is softening is not emotion, but sensation, temperature, pressure, tightness, movement. Before feelings have names, they have locations. Before stories form, there is bodily information. This is why emotional return often begins quietly. Not with catharsis, but with noticing. A heaviness in the chest that wasn't there before. A tightening in the throat during a conversation. A slight warmth in the face when something matters. These signals are not dramatic, but they are alive. They represent the nervous system testing the ground. A useful image here is frozen soil. When ground has been frozen for a long time, applying heat too fast doesn't restore fertility. It cracks the surface. It damages structure. Thaw happens gradually, through consistent, moderate warmth, through cycles that the earth can tolerate. The same principle applies internally. When emotional numbness has protected against overwhelm, the system requires evidence that feeling will not lead to collapse. That evidence is built through repetition, not intensity, through experiences that are manageable, predictable, and contained. This doesn't look impressive from the outside. There are no breakthroughs to announce, but internally, something important is happening. The guard begins to relax, not because he was overpowered, but because he is no longer alone, because conditions have changed slowly enough for trust to register. This prepares the ground for integration, not dramatic release, but reconnection, not emotional flooding, but gradual inhabiting of experience, the return of feeling as a byproduct of safety, meaning, and truth aligning again. And with that preparation in place, the conversation reaches its final movement. Because when numbness is understood not as an enemy, but as a protector who never stood down, the entire frame shifts. What follows is not a fight, but a reunion. By now, a different picture of emotional numbness may be taking shape, not as a defect to eliminate, but as a role that was never meant to be permanent. A state that once made sense, held longer than intended, because no one ever came to relieve it. A useful image is the night watchman. He stands at the edge of the city while others sleep, scanning the dark for threats that may never arrive. He is not cruel. He is not broken. He is devoted. He learned vigilance because vigilance once mattered, and over time, no one told him the danger had passed. Emotional numbness functions much the same way. It keeps watch. It reduces exposure. It limits sensation to preserve stability. Fighting it only strengthens its resolve. Misunderstanding it prolongs its duty. Integration begins when the guard is acknowledged rather than attacked, when the system senses appreciation instead of pressure, when the message changes from stand down to you're not alone anymore. This is where meaning, regulation, and truth quietly begin to work together. Meaning restores direction, giving action a reason to matter again. Regulation restores rhythm, allowing sensation to return without overwhelm. Truth restores trust, making it possible to face inner experience without collapse. None of this happens all at once. Feeling does not return as a flood. It returns as texture, as moments of contact, as subtle warmth where there was once nothing, as edges softening, as a tension settling into the body without urgency. The return of emotion is not about chasing intensity. It is about rebuilding trust. Trust that feeling will be met. Trust that it will move. Trust that it will not destroy what matters. When that trust begins to form, the guard no longer has to stand alone. And when he is relieved, not dismissed, but relieved, the gates don't fly open. They open gradually, enough for air to move, enough for life to register again. If this mapped your experience, add one signal you recognized below. One line is enough. It helps others see what you just saw.